Do you appreciate having religious freedom? Do you enjoy congregating in a church today without having to worry about being persecuted for your personal beliefs? Did you know that for many centuries, people all over the world could not enjoy the religious liberties we now have? So what happened that caused this revolution of religious freedom to occur? It was the Reformation that changed the world. This movement began in 1517 and was initiated by Martin Luther. It gave a path to freedom. It gave a path to follow Christ and not man-made religion. We can now follow Jesus without having to buy salvation, either with money or with good works. I will demonstrate that the Reformation teaches us to understand the two most common ways of salvation that most religions today practice, but only one of them is true. There is the man-made, humanistic way of salvation, and there is the divine-made, God's way of salvation. All religions of the world are centered upon either one of these two belief systems, but only one of them is true. After the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the apostles went to the ends of the world, proclaiming the good news of the gospel. And during the first couple of centuries, being a Christian was not easy and often meant death. But in the 4th century, Emperor Constantine made it legal to be a Christian. Shortly after this, Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and it became corrupt as time went on. Instead of following Jesus with sincerity and love, the leaders of the Roman Empire used Christianity as a religion to gain power and control. Corrupt kings and emperors used it for their advantage. This perverted power gave way to a universal religion called Catholicism. It became so corrupt that it oppressed most of its citizens. But not all leaders of the Catholic Church were corrupt. In the 1500s, a Catholic priest by the name of Martin Luther began to question the church. He struggled within himself many of the same things we struggle with. Luther was very strict in his beliefs. He hated himself for failing to fulfill his religious duties. He oftentimes tried to please God the wrong way. When he would fail God in some shape or form, he would punish himself. There were times when he was so disappointed at himself for messing up that he would hit himself with a rod or a leather whip. Luther may have asked himself, at what point enough is enough? Or, what can I do to please an angry God who hates sin that I am so guilty of? Then, one day, as he studied the Bible, he came to a passage of scripture in Ephesians chapter 2, where it states, "For by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God." Having been enlightened by this scripture, Luther was on his way to discovering true divine salvation. Luther was also a serious student of St. Augustine. In his library of books, Luther remembered studying about a debate that took place 1200 years ago in the 4th century. The debate was between St. Augustine and Pelagius. These two men argued about God's way of salvation. Augustine stated that grace is bestowed by God on the elect according to his sovereign decrees, and due to Adam and Eve's fall, no one can be saved except by the divine will of God. But Pelagius argued contrary to this, and that Adam and Eve's fall had nothing to do with inheriting a sinful nature. Pelagius argued that anyone can be saved, so as long as they have the will to do it. But Augustine argued that a person cannot be saved on their own power, and that it is the unalterable decrees of God that ultimately determines the fate of a person. As the scripture states, in Romans 9, verse 18. Therefore hath he mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will harden. Augustine firmly debated that because of Adam and Eve's fall, the entire human race was subject to eternal death. Unless God rescues the sinner, there can be no salvation, and that there will be no fault on God if he allowed all humanity to perish and not to rescue anybody. Augustine further stated that God, by his sovereign grace and from eternity past, has predestinated the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. Ephesians 1, verse 5. He argued, this is the divine course and disposition of all existence in the universe, and that absolutely everything is determined by God. Otherwise, if not, then God will not be able to sustain the universe with the palm of his hand, and his sovereignty is of no effect. This is the true definition of amazing grace for God's children. All other methods of salvation are humanistic and man-made. After studying these ancient debates, along with the revelation of Ephesians 2:8, Luther was convinced that only the sovereignty of a merciful God and his undeserving grace would be the only thing capable enough to save sinners, and that any organization or religion that was contrary to God's sovereignty is a false religion. Luther believed that there could only be one God who is in control of all things, including the salvation of our souls. No church organization can take his place nor determine this. And that was the problem with the Catholic Church. Not only was the Catholic Church corrupt, but many of its leaders were money hungry. They did not care about the spiritual welfare of the people. Luther was able to see clear how corrupt this system was. He could sense the Spirit of God tugging on his heart to do something about this corruption. At first, he did not know where to begin. Also, speaking against the Catholic Church was very risky and possibly may lead to his death. Luther finally had enough when he saw the leaders of the church selling paper notes called indulgences. These paper notes were supposed to be a sort of coupon or ticket out of hell, and the Catholic Church was selling them quickly and efficiently. Luther questioned some of the leaders of the church that were selling these tickets. He told them that the practice of selling these indulgences were not consistent with the Bible's way of salvation. This was a humanistic, man-made way of salvation, and not God's. On October 31st, 1517, Luther went to Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and nailed written statements on the front door of the building. These written statements were called the 95 Theses. They expressed his concern about the wrong practices of the Catholic Church. He challenged the sale of indulgences being done by the Catholic Church. All he wanted to do was to debate and reform the church in general. But little did he know that this initial action would ignite an entire continent and change the course of history forever. We as Protestants are thankful today for what Luther did some 500 years ago. The Reformation is just one example between a man-made humanistic approach to salvation and God's only way of salvation, and confronting this issue. Although this historic event happened many years ago, we still can see people doing the same mistakes currently today. How many religions do you know today that are either trying to buy, purchase, or earn their salvation? We see false religions such as the Jehovah's Witnesses trying to earn their salvation by working in hours, witnessing to people. This is their way of working and earning their way to salvation. Or how about the Mormons, riding their bicycles with their neat white shirts and ties? How about us? Are we making the same mistakes? Regardless of what denomination we belong to, we should always examine ourselves, and we must depend on God's mercy and grace and the full work of Jesus Christ for the salvation of our souls. Anything more than that is a humanistic and man-made way to salvation. I would like to conclude this essay with a quote written by Jonathan Edwards, which says, "No one can sneak their way into heaven by some secret gate. None can be saved according to God's immutable constitution, except they experience such influences of the Spirit of God working grace in their hearts, causing a work of regeneration." Don't harden your heart in sin when God calls upon you, and postpone the welfare of your soul, because salvation is not within your own power to obtain it. And as the Gospel of John in the 3rd chapter, verse 27 states, "A man can receive nothing unless it has been given to him from heaven."